The greatest flood in human history wasn't a myth. It was real, it ended the Ice Age, and it changed our world forever. Kind of wild when you think about it. One moment, Earth was covered in ice, and the next, the planet was warming, melting, cracking, and flooding like it suddenly remembered it had bills to pay. But don't worry, tonight, we're not here to panic. This is a bedtime story. So take a breath, get comfortable, settle into whatever cozy position works for you, and let's drift back in time together. We're going all the way to the end of the Ice Age, around 15,000 years ago, when something huge happened. Something powerful enough to reshape continents, erase coastlines, and leave behind a mystery humans have been whispering about ever since. Before we dive into glaciers crashing and megafloods thundering across the land, let's set the stage with 3 simple questions. These are the heart of the story we're telling tonight. First, how did the world suddenly warm up so fast that giant ice sheets started breaking apart like unstable Lego towers? Back then, the planet wasn't supposed to melt this quickly. But something changed. Something nudged the climate just enough, and the ice felt it. And when the ice feels anything, trust me, the whole planet feels it too. Second, what exactly happened during the giant flood that helped end the Ice Age? Because yes, there really was a flood. And it wasn't rain filling up a valley. This was a wall of water roaring across entire continents. This was lakes the size of modern seas suddenly draining in a matter of days. Imagine waking up one morning and your entire world is underwater. That's the kind of event we're talking about. And third, how did all of this shape human history and the world we live in today? When the sea rose, coastlines vanished. Villages disappeared. People had to move, sometimes hundreds of miles inland. And some scientists even think that the great flood myths of the world, from Noah to ancient Mesopotamia to India and Greece, might be distant memories of these massive ancient floods. These 3 questions guide everything we're about to explore. But before we continue, here's the part where I go a little beyond expectations. I didn't just skim a few websites or rewatch a documentary. I spent days digging through research papers, old geology notes, maps of ancient coastlines, and studies from scientists who live and breathe this stuff. I wanted to make sure this video didn't just tell a story. I wanted it to bring you into the world as it really was, as clearly as we can understand it today. Your job is much easier. You just relax. You can close your eyes if you want and let your mind drift. Tonight, we're walking into a world of frozen landscapes, huge animals, long nights, and ancient people who were just trying to survive. Right before everything changed. There's something strangely comforting about that. Because this whole story, the melting, the flooding, the chaos, humans lived through it. They adapted, they moved, they learned, and they told stories about it for thousands of years. And now we're following their footsteps, tracing the clues they left behind across the land and beneath the sea. So whether you're here to fall asleep, to relax, or just enjoy a calm journey into deep history, I made this for you. A slow, cozy walk into the past. A story of water, ice, and the night the world began to thaw. All right, let's begin our journey into the ancient world, and meet the Ice Age before it melted away. If you could step outside 20,000 years ago, the first thing you'd notice is the cold. Not just a little chilly, but the kind of cold that makes you wonder why you even got out of bed, or in this case, your little Ice Age shelter. The world back then was covered in ice. Huge ice sheets stretched across North America, Europe, and Asia. These weren't just icy hills or frozen lakes. They were giant, endless blankets of ice that could swallow entire forests. Mountains. Compared to these ice sheets, mountains were just tiny bumps. The oceans were frozen too, at least in the sense that a lot of the water was trapped in the ice. Sea levels were about 120 meters lower than today. Coastlines stretched far into areas that are now underwater. People could walk from one place to another that is now a sea, completely dry. Places we now think of as beaches, bays, and shallow seas were probably fields, rivers, or plains. The world looked very different. It was quiet, still, and calm, until you remembered just how dangerous it could be. Humans back then weren't sitting around with smartphones or even cooking marshmallows over fire. They were busy surviving. They used simple tools made of stone, bone, and wood. Camps were tiny, practical, and mobile, because staying in one place too long could be dangerous. Herds of animals might wander close, or predators could decide you looked like dinner. Migration was a big part of life. Groups followed herds of mammoths, bison, and other animals, moving with the seasons and the food supply. You can imagine them trudging through snow, carrying everything they owned on their backs, and probably grumbling about how winter seemed to last forever. Speaking of animals, this was the age of megafauna. The kind of creatures you'd probably faint at the sight of. Mammoths, with their massive curved tusks, wandering through snowy plains. Saber-toothed cats, lurking in the shadows, probably judging your outfit choices. Giant ground sloths, slowly shuffling across the land, like mobile hills with claws. Humans weren't alone, but they were tiny compared to everything around them. And yet somehow, they managed to survive. Clever, resourceful, and probably a little lucky. Life in this frozen world had a rhythm. Winters were long and harsh. Summers were short and fleeting. Fires kept people warm and safe, and early humans learned to read the signs of the seasons. They knew when the herds would move, where to find shelter, and how to make the most of a world dominated by ice. And even in the harshest winters, the world had a strange kind of beauty. Snow-covered forests, frozen rivers glittering in pale sunlight, and the quiet hush that comes when everything is covered in frost. It was peaceful in a way that's hard to imagine today. But the ice wasn't static. Even at the peak of the last glacial maximum, the world was starting to change. Tiny shifts in climate, imperceptible to humans, were already beginning to take hold. Air temperature rose slightly, ice sheets began to crack, and rivers slowly started to carve new paths. Glaciers creaked and groaned as they shifted ever so slightly. The changes were small at first, but they set the stage for something much bigger. Imagine standing at the edge of a massive glacier. The air is cold, the wind bites, and the ice stretches endlessly in front of you. It's peaceful, yes, but there's a quiet tension. Water is trapped beneath the ice. Snow piles are building up. The landscape is alive in ways you might not notice. And humans, despite their small size, were moving through this frozen world, following the animals, finding food, and just trying to stay warm enough to see another day. Life wasn't easy. Hunting a mammoth was a massive undertaking, literally and figuratively. A group might spend days tracking the herd, waiting for the right moment. The cold was relentless, but humans had fire, tools, and ingenuity on their side. They knew how to build shelters that kept out the wind, how to stitch animal hides into clothes, and how to make weapons that could actually bring down enormous creatures. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. At night, the world was quiet. You'd hear the wind rushing over the ice, the distant growl of a predator, the crunch of snow underfoot. Campfires glowed, casting long shadows on the snow. Families huddled together, sharing stories, passing knowledge, and keeping the small human flame alive in a vast, frozen world. It was survival, yes, but it was also community, ingenuity, and resilience. And while humans lived their lives in this icy expanse, the earth itself was quietly preparing for change. The ice sheets, enormous and seemingly eternal, were slowly shifting. Meltwater began to form lakes beneath the glaciers, trapped by walls of ice. Snow and ice accumulated in some areas, melted slightly in others. The air was changing, subtle at first, but enough to set the stage for the great events to come. Humans wouldn't realize it for thousands of years, but the frozen world they called home was about to be transformed. This was a world both terrifying and beautiful, a place where survival demanded skill and courage, and where nature's quiet power shaped every step. And in the hush of this ice-covered earth, the story of one of the greatest floods in history was waiting, quietly, beneath the frozen surface, ready to change everything. Around 17,000 years ago, the frozen world that humans had called home for thousands of years began to whisper that something was changing. The cold, vast plains and towering ice sheets weren't as solid as they had seemed. The glaciers, those giant sleeping giants of ice, started to stir. Not in a loud, dramatic way. At first, it was subtle. The edges of the ice sheets melted just a little more each summer. Streams appeared where there had been frozen rock. Tiny rivers flowed under the ice, carving hidden tunnels that humans couldn't see. It was almost like the earth was slowly exhaling after holding its breath for centuries. Humans, of course, didn't know they were witnessing the first hints of global warming. They were busy living their lives, following herds, hunting mammoths, moving from one ice-free valley to another. But if they had paid close attention, they might have noticed small changes. Maybe the snow melted a bit earlier in spring. Maybe the rivers didn't freeze as long in the winter. Maybe certain plants started creeping northward. Subtle, almost unnoticeable shifts that would later change everything. The climate wasn't changing in one simple direction. The Ice Age world was full of ups and downs, called climate oscillations. Some years were colder, some slightly warmer. The planet liked to tease people. One year, winter would feel harsh and unending. The next, it would be just a little softer. But these small variations were clues, evidence that the Earth was ready to shake off the frozen cloak it had worn for so long. Ice cores pulled from Greenland and Antarctica tell us the story in a way humans back then couldn't. Scientists today can look at the tiny air bubbles trapped in ice layers, reading the composition of ancient atmospheres. They can see how temperatures fluctuated, how snow fell differently, how tiny shifts in greenhouse gases set the stage for massive melting. Pollen preserved in sediments shows that forests and plants were moving slowly north. Life was creeping back into places that had been barren for thousands of years. Everything was responding to a warming world, even if humans didn't realize it yet. For animals, the warming was a signal. Herds migrated to follow the food. Mammoths moved to new grazing lands. Saber-toothed cats and wolves followed the herds. And humans, well, humans followed the animals. Their migration patterns shifted as well. Routes they had traveled for generations changed because the ice and snow were no longer in the same places. Even a small rise in temperature could turn a familiar hunting path into a swamp or a lake. Survival depended on paying attention, and humans were experts at noticing patterns in nature. The ice sheets themselves began to respond to the warming. Glaciers started thinning. Some ice shelves cracked, letting water seep through. Beneath the surface, hidden lakes began to form, trapped between layers of ice. These glacial lakes were enormous, holding more water than entire modern seas. They were nature's ticking time bombs, waiting for the moment when ice dams would give way. Tiny changes in air temperature, snow accumulation, and river flow could eventually trigger catastrophic floods. It wasn't just the ice and animals that were changing. Coastlines shifted as sea levels rose, slowly at first. Water that had been trapped in ice began to return to the oceans. Land bridges that humans and animals had used to migrate between continents started disappearing. Places like Beringia, the land bridge between Alaska and Siberia, were still accessible for now, but the clock was ticking. Humans had to adapt quickly, or risk being trapped in shrinking habitable zones. Geological evidence from this time paints a picture of a restless world. Sediment layers show that rivers carved new paths as meltwater from glaciers flowed downstream. Varves, annual layers of mud in lakes, record sudden pulses of meltwater that hint at instability within the ice. Even subtle geological shifts could have had massive consequences for both humans and animals. The world was moving, literally and figuratively, under everyone's feet. For humans, these changes weren't just inconvenient. They were life-altering. Hunting grounds moved. Freshwater sources shifted. Camps that had been safe for decades could suddenly be near flooding rivers or landslides caused by melting ice. And yet, humans adapted. They learned to read the signs of the changing world. They became even more mobile, more resourceful. They followed the herds, tracked the plants, and stayed alive through a world in transition. Their survival depended on noticing small shifts and acting quickly. This slow warming, combined with small climate oscillations, set the stage for something far bigger: the sudden collapse of ice and the release of massive amounts of water into the oceans. The meltwater pulse that would follow was building, quietly, beneath the glaciers. Ice sheets like the Laurentide in North America and parts of Antarctica were slowly destabilizing. The water trapped behind them wasn't staying quiet for long. And when it moved, it would do so all at once, changing coastlines and landscapes forever. But before the flood came, the earth whispered its warning through rivers, pollen, and sediments. Ice sheets groaned under the pressure of melting water. Small lakes swelled behind fragile ice dams. Glaciers cracked and shifted. Humans, going about their daily lives, may have noticed some of these signs: unusual river flows, sudden openings in the ice, or new plants creeping into old hunting grounds. They probably didn't understand the full picture, but they were experiencing it firsthand. And this is important to remember. The slow warming wasn't just a prelude. It was a process that taught life to adapt. Animals, humans, plants, and the ice itself were all responding to the same subtle signals. This period of gentle change set the conditions for the greatest natural floods in human history. The world was awakening, moving from frozen stability to dynamic, liquid chaos. And humans were right there, experiencing it, hunting, migrating, surviving, and watching a world slowly change before their eyes. By the end of this warming phase, the world had begun a transformation that no one could have predicted. Ice sheets were thinner, rivers were stronger, coastlines had shifted, and life had adapted. The slow warming laid the groundwork for the cataclysm to come. And while humans may have thought life was just slightly different from year to year, the planet was preparing for a flood that would dwarf anything they had ever seen. It was quiet, subtle, and almost peaceful, the kind of change you barely notice until it becomes unstoppable. And that's exactly what was happening. The Ice Age was letting go, one small shift at a time, preparing the world for a sudden, dramatic, and unforgettable transformation. Around 15,000 years ago, something incredible began to happen beneath the slowly melting ice sheets. Hidden lakes, rivers, and meltwater trapped under glaciers suddenly started to break free. Scientists today call one of the biggest events during this time Meltwater Pulse 1A, and it's one of the most dramatic moments in Earth's history. Picture it: sea levels rising by more than 50 feet in what, in geological terms, is almost an instant. For humans living near the coasts back then, it must have felt like the world was literally rising up around them. Now, we have to remember, humans at the time didn't know why the seas were creeping inland. They didn't have maps, GPS, or weather reports. They only saw the land slowly disappearing. A favorite hunting ground might suddenly be underwater. Rivers could overflow or shift. Their survival depended on moving with the land, following animals, and hoping the world stayed predictable, which it was not. So where did all this water come from? Scientists have been debating it for decades. One of the main suspects is the Laurentide ice sheet, a colossal glacier covering much of North America. It held enough ice to raise sea levels by dozens of meters if it all melted at once. But it wasn't just melting evenly. Parts of it collapsed catastrophically, sending enormous amounts of fresh water into rivers, lakes, and eventually the ocean. Imagine a frozen dam cracking and unleashing a wall of water hundreds of feet high. That's basically what happened, on a continental scale. Some researchers also point to Antarctica as a possible source. Ice sheets there were unstable in some regions, and warming could have caused sudden collapses. Others think the water came from both North America and Antarctica at the same time, creating a flood that changed coastlines worldwide. The truth is, no one knows for certain, and that's part of what makes this story so fascinating. It's like a mystery Earth left behind in its rocks, ice, and sediments. When these meltwater pulses occurred, the effects were dramatic. Water didn't just flow like a normal river. It carved massive channels through the landscape. Rocks that had been still for millennia moved. Valleys deepened. Canyons widened. Floodwaters swept away forests, soils, and even small hills. Imagine a wall of water racing across the land with the strength of thousands of rivers combined. That's exactly what these pulses did. The speed and force were enough to change entire landscapes overnight. And humans, they had a front row seat. Some may have been living near the edges of lakes, watching the ice dams hold back enormous amounts of water like someone trying to balance a full bucket on a narrow ledge. Others may have been traveling along rivers that suddenly swelled and overflowed. For some, the floodwaters were terrifying. For others, they were mysterious signals of a world that no longer behaved like it had before. Either way, it was impossible to ignore. Geologists today study the channels, sediments, and evidence left by these meltwater pulses to reconstruct what happened. They look at the paths carved by rushing water, the layers of sand and mud deposited downstream, and even the giant ripple marks left behind in the earth. It's like Earth was a giant notebook, and each flood left a page for us to read thousands of years later. These clues tell a story of sudden, unstoppable change, and they show how powerful water can be when ice gives way. One of the most amazing things about Meltwater Pulse 1A is how fast it happened. Sea levels rose dozens of feet in just a few centuries. That may not sound fast to us, but in geological terms, it's a blink of an eye. Humans would have noticed rivers overflowing more often, coastal areas flooding, and the disappearance of flatlands they may have hunted or settled on. The world they had known for generations was shifting beneath their feet, literally. Some scientists also suggest that this sudden influx of freshwater may have had other effects, like changing ocean currents. Oceans are like giant conveyor belts, moving heat and salt around the planet. Adding enormous amounts of freshwater suddenly could disrupt these currents, cooling some regions while warming others. So while humans were seeing rising waters, the planet was also adjusting its climate in response. The stage was set for a world that was far less predictable than it had been during the last glacial maximum. The beauty and terror of meltwater pulse won a lie in its scale and suddenness. It wasn't just a flood. It was a planetary reshaping event. Entire coastlines vanished beneath the rising seas. Rivers that had been familiar for generations carved new paths. Valleys that had once been dry became lakes. And yet, life persisted. Humans adapted, animals migrated, and plants spread into newly available lands. The world was changing, but life was stubbornly resilient. And while the floodwaters moved, the stories began. Though humans didn't write anything down, oral traditions may have recorded these events. Tales of sudden inundation, disappearing lands, and roaring waters could have been passed down from generation to generation. Over time, these stories might have inspired the flood myths we know today, from Noah to Gilgamesh. Real events, interpreted and remembered, shaped culture long after the waters receded. In the grand scheme of Earth's history, Meltwater Pulse 1A was just the beginning. It showed how rapidly a planet can shift when ice melts and water flows freely. It was a warning, a signal, and a dramatic demonstration of nature's power. Humans, small as they were, experienced the opening act of a flood that would continue reshaping the planet for thousands of years. By the end of this pulse, coastlines had moved inland, landscapes were altered, and the Earth had begun a transformation that would eventually lead to the cataclysmic floods of the Missoula and Agassiz lakes. But for now, in this moment, the planet was waking up from its frozen slumber. Ice was melting, water was racing across continents, and life, including humans, was adjusting to a world that had suddenly become far less predictable. And so, the mysterious meltwater pulse began, a signal of change, a force of nature, and the precursor to one of the most dramatic reshaping events in Earth's history. The frozen world was giving way, slowly at first, then with unstoppable momentum. And the story of the Great Flood, the flood that would end the Ice Age, was quietly starting to unfold. As the ice sheets slowly melted, something incredible, and slightly terrifying, began to happen. Water that had been trapped for thousands of years started pooling in enormous lakes. These weren't your average lakes with a few ducks and fish. No, these were giant, epic bodies of water, held back only by walls of ice. Picture a lake bigger than all the Great Lakes combined, sitting quietly behind a glacier that could collapse at any moment. That's the kind of water we're talking about. Some of the most famous of these glacial lakes were Lake Agassiz in North America and Lake Missoula in what is now Montana. Lake Agassiz alone may have held enough water to cover much of Canada and parts of the northern United States in hundreds of feet of water. Lake Missoula? A massive freshwater lake that could drown a modern city in minutes if its ice dam failed. These lakes were ticking time bombs, and everyone on Earth had no idea they existed, except maybe the animals that avoided them instinctively. Or at least we like to imagine that. The ice dams holding back these lakes were fragile. They weren't made of concrete or steel. They were made of frozen water. And frozen water, as it turns out, is not great at holding back millions of gallons of meltwater when the sun and warmer air are slowly doing their work. The pressure built up year after year, inch by inch, until one day, and no one could have predicted exactly when, the dam would fail. And when it did, the result was spectacular, terrifying, and completely unstoppable. Evidence of these massive glacial lakes comes from varves, which are layers of sediment left behind in lakes each year. Each layer tells a story: snow, meltwater, silt, sand, trapped in time. Scientists today can study these layers like chapters in a book. They reveal how the lakes grew, how the ice held back the water, and when the pressures became too much. Each varve is a silent witness to a world that existed before humans left any written records. The water in these lakes wasn't just sitting still. It was constantly moving, creeping against the ice, filling depressions in the land, carving small channels that would eventually become massive flood paths. Imagine walking along a quiet frozen valley and hearing the faint trickle of water under the ice. That trickle is millions of gallons of water trying to escape, quietly preparing for chaos. To us, it's almost poetic. To a human hunter or herder back then, it might have seemed like nature was playing a game that no one could win. When the ice dams finally failed, the results were catastrophic. Walls of water hundreds of feet tall surged across the land. Entire forests were uprooted. Rivers overflowed, flooding valleys and carving new channels in hours, not decades. Boulders were moved like toys. Canyons formed in what had once been flat plains. The force of these floods was unimaginable, and it happened multiple times over thousands of years. Each failure was a chapter in the story of the Ice Age's end. Humans witnessing these events probably had mixed reactions. Some may have been terrified, running for higher ground, watching everything they knew vanish beneath roaring water. Others might have been awed, recognizing the power of nature and its ability to reshape the world in ways no one could control. Whatever they felt, it's likely they remembered these events and passed them down in stories. Stories of great waters, angry skies, and unstoppable forces. These could even be the earliest seeds of the flood myths we know today. The lakes themselves were dynamic systems. In some years, melting ice would fill them faster than expected. In others, evaporation or minor breaches would lower the water level temporarily. This constant ebb and flow created tension, a slow, invisible pressure that could explode at any moment. It's like living with a volcano under your house, except instead of lava, it's water, and instead of smoke, it's the quiet rumble of ice slowly giving way. Scientists today use computer models, geological mapping, and sediment analysis to reconstruct these events. They look at the giant ripple marks left behind in dried-up floodplains. They measure the massive boulders transported miles from their original locations. They trace the paths of ancient rivers carved by these megafloods. Each piece of evidence points to one conclusion: when the ice dams failed, the water did not trickle. It roared, carved, and reshaped entire continents. And while these lakes and floods were happening in North America, similar events were occurring around the world. Ice sheets in Europe, Asia, and even Antarctica were unstable. Meltwater pulses from these regions contributed to global sea level rise, slowly changing coastlines and creating challenges for humans living near the oceans. The world was waking up from its frozen slumber, and water was leading the charge. It's easy to forget that while we study these events in a calm, academic way today, for the people living through them, it was terrifying. Imagine hunting in a valley one year, only to return and find the whole place underwater, carved into a canyon you didn't recognize. Or following a herd of mammoths across familiar plains, only to find their grazing lands gone. Nature was no longer predictable. Ice, water, and weather worked together in ways humans couldn't anticipate, forcing them to adapt or move. Despite the danger, life persisted. Humans, animals, and plants all found ways to cope. Herds moved to safer areas. Humans built new camps. Plants colonized the new floodplains once the waters receded. The lakes, in a way, were both destroyers and creators, erasing old landscapes and forming new ones. And over thousands of years, these repeated floods left permanent marks on the planet. Valleys, channels, and ripples still visible today are a record of that incredible power. By the end of this chapter of the Ice Age, the stage was set for the most dramatic events to come. The glacial lakes had stored massive amounts of water. Ice dams were weakening. Meltwater pulses were increasing. Humans were still surviving, still migrating, still observing the strange and changing world around them. But the tension was building. The Earth was preparing for a moment when millions of years of frozen stability would give way to unstoppable liquid force. And that, quietly, is the story of the glacial lakes, nature's ticking time bombs, patiently waiting for the perfect moment to unleash one of the greatest floods in Earth's history. Imagine standing near a massive frozen lake, tucked behind a wall of ice taller than any building you've ever seen. The sun is out, the wind is cold, and everything seems calm. But beneath the ice, water is pressing, pushing, waiting. The pressure has been building for years, maybe decades. No one knows exactly when the ice will give, but everyone knows it's fragile. The cracks have started. The rumbling has begun. And then, with a sound like the earth itself groaning, the ice finally breaks. It's hard to even imagine what happened next. A wall of water hundreds of feet tall surged across the land. For comparison, imagine Niagara Falls multiplied hundreds of times, moving faster than a stampede of mammoths. Trees, rocks, and soil were swept away as if nature had decided to hit the reset button. The landscape, which had been frozen and seemingly permanent for thousands of years, was erased almost overnight. The Missoula floods, as scientists call these events in North America, were some of the most dramatic examples of ice dam failure. Lake Missoula, held back by a fragile wall of ice, released its water in a cataclysmic torrent. The force of the water carved canyons, uprooted forests, and carried boulders the size of small houses for miles. It was like the planet had decided to remix the topography entirely, and humans were living in the first-row seats. Early humans witnessing these floods must have been terrified. Imagine standing on a hill, looking down at a river turned into a raging, unstoppable wall of water. Camps that had been safe for decades could disappear in hours. Paths used to hunt mammoths might vanish under rushing torrents. Herds of animals would be swept away, forcing humans to scramble for survival. And yet, somehow, humans adapted. They moved, they watched, they waited for the waters to calm, and they survived. The ice dams themselves made a lot of noise before failing. Glaciers groaned and cracked under the pressure. Water seeped through tiny gaps, widening them slowly at first, then suddenly rushing through with explosive force. The sound must have been deafening, a deep, resonant roar echoing across valleys and mountains. It was nature announcing, in no uncertain terms, that the world was changing and that nothing would stay the same. As the water moved, it didn't behave like a normal river. It surged across the land with incredible speed and force, carving new channels and floodplains. Valleys widened, coulees deepened, and the earth was scoured clean. Giant ripple marks formed in the landscape, evidence of the water's incredible speed and volume. Scientists today still marvel at these features, trying to imagine how a frozen, quiet valley could transform so dramatically in hours. The Missoula floods didn't just move water, they moved everything in it. Rocks that had been stationary for millennia were transported miles downstream. Trees, stripped of their roots, floated along with debris, creating temporary, chaotic rafts. The force of the water could bend and twist the earth, eroding soils and carving out features that would last for thousands of years. For anyone witnessing it, it must have seemed as if the planet itself was alive, reshaping itself at incredible speed. Interestingly, these floods didn't always happen just once. Lake Missoula, for example, flooded multiple times over a few thousand years. Each failure of the ice dam brought a new wave of destruction. Between floods, humans would have returned to the newly scoured land, trying to rebuild, hunt, and survive. But eventually, the ice would rebuild, melt again, and the cycle would repeat. Life was a constant negotiation with nature's extreme moods. Humans weren't the only ones affected. Animals, too, had to respond quickly. Herds of mammoths, bison, and horses would have to move fast to avoid the surging waters. Predators like saber-toothed cats and wolves would be forced to follow prey or find new hunting grounds. Entire ecosystems were temporarily displaced, reshaped by the overwhelming force of water and ice. Geological evidence from these floods is everywhere today. Deep channels, giant ripple marks, and scoured landscapes reveal how water carved through the continent. Boulders and sediments transported far from their source tell the story of unstoppable force. Scientists once doubted that such floods could have happened, until the evidence became undeniable. It was a dramatic example of how catastrophic natural events could shape the planet almost overnight. The floods also had a profound effect on the people living near the edges of these glacial lakes. Communities had to relocate. Hunting and gathering patterns shifted. People had to be more mobile, more observant, and more adaptable. Survival depended on paying attention to subtle warning signs: cracking ice, rising water, unusual river flows. Humans were small compared to the forces of nature, but their resilience allowed them to persist. And while the Missoula floods are the best studied example, similar ice dam failures and megafloods occurred in other parts of the world as well. Ice sheets in Europe, Asia, and even Antarctica contributed to rising seas and dramatic changes in river systems. The end of the Ice Age was not gentle. It was a period of rapid, often violent transformation, and humans were witnessing it firsthand. From a modern perspective, it's hard not to feel awe at these floods. The scale, the speed, and the power are almost unimaginable. But for the people living at the time, it was life, survival, adaptation, observation. Every day was a negotiation with forces far beyond their control. And yet, they endured. They witnessed one of the most dramatic natural events in Earth's history and lived to pass down the memory, perhaps even inspiring the flood myths that survive today. By the end of the day, when the ice dams failed, landscapes had been completely rewritten. Valleys became canyons, plains became riverbeds, and lakes drained in hours to reshape the world. Water had carved its signature on the land, leaving behind clues that scientists would discover thousands of years later. The world, once frozen and stable, had become dynamic, unpredictable, and alive with motion. And so, the day the ice dams failed was not just a day of destruction. It was a day of transformation. It was a demonstration of nature's incredible power, the fragility of frozen landscapes, and the resilience of humans who lived through it. From that point on, the world would never look the same again. The Ice Age was ending, the floods were beginning, and the story of Earth's great transformation was being written in water, ice, and stone. After the ice dams failed and the megafloods surged across the landscape, something truly astonishing appeared: the channeled scablands. If you've never heard of them, imagine a place where the earth itself seems to have been shredded, carved, and rearranged by some giant, invisible hand. Valleys widened, canyons deepened, and huge ripples in the ground stretched for miles, like the planet had tried to knit itself back together with giant stitches after being torn apart. And in a way, that's exactly what happened. Water, moving with unimaginable force, reshaped the land almost overnight. This dramatic transformation is mostly the result of the Missoula floods we just talked about. When Lake Missoula's ice dam broke, the water didn't just flow quietly downstream. It surged, it roared, it swept away soil, rocks, and trees, leaving behind the strange alien landscape we now call the scablands. Dry falls, coulees, and giant ripple marks litter the area. Signs that the floods weren't gentle or polite. They were fast, relentless, and powerful beyond comprehension. It's hard to imagine what it must have looked like to the humans living nearby. One day, familiar hunting grounds and river paths. The next, an unrecognizable, chaotic terrain. Scientists who studied the scablands in the 20th century were initially baffled. In the 1920s and 1930s, geologist J. Harlan Bretz visited the region and noticed the bizarre features: huge dry falls, enormous channels carved deep into bedrock, and ripple marks taller than houses. He proposed a radical idea, that the scablands were created by massive, sudden floods. At the time, most of the scientific community thought he was crazy. They couldn't believe nature could move that much water, that fast. Catastrophic floods didn't fit with their ideas of slow, gradual geological change. They called his theory unbelievable. But Bretz was persistent. He kept studying, collecting evidence, measuring ripple marks, and tracing channels. Slowly, over decades, his ideas gained traction. By the 1970s, the scientific community had accepted that the scablands were indeed shaped by enormous floods. The world had been dramatically reshaped in hours, not millennia. Bretz's work reminds us that sometimes the Earth doesn't follow the rules we expect. It's chaotic, violent, and full of surprises. The scablands are full of fascinating features. Dry Falls, for instance, is a cliff that was once part of a waterfall larger than Niagara Falls. Coulees, deep, steep-sided channels, were carved as floodwaters tore through bedrock. And the giant ripple marks you can still see today are like fingerprints of the megafloods, evidence of how water moved across the landscape at astonishing speed. Each feature tells a story, frozen in stone, waiting for humans to decipher it thousands of years later. Humans witnessing these changes would have felt small and powerless. One moment, a valley might have been perfect for hunting or camping. The next, it could be a canyon filled with turbulent waters. Herds of animals would have been forced to relocate. Early humans had to be nimble, observant, and ready to adapt to survive. These floods didn't just move water, they moved the entire ecosystem, and humans had to follow suit. And yet, there's something awe-inspiring about it too. Imagine standing on a ridge, looking over the newly formed scablands, seeing the channels carved by unstoppable water, imagining the sheer force it took to shape the land. It's terrifying, yes, but also a reminder of the planet's incredible power. It's hard not to feel humbled in the presence of such monumental change. The scablands also help us understand how ancient landscapes could influence human history. These floods forced migration, changed hunting grounds, and reshaped the environment humans relied on. They were living in a world that didn't stay still, a world that could transform in a matter of hours or days. And in some ways, that unpredictability may have shaped human ingenuity. People had to adapt, move, and survive, and those skills would carry forward into the rise of civilizations much later. Interestingly, evidence from the scablands also shows that these floods didn't just happen once. Lake Missoula drained and refilled multiple times over a few thousand years, creating repeated pulses of water that reshaped the landscape over and over. Each flood left its mark, carving deeper channels, moving larger boulders, and creating new features. It's like a series of giant strokes on a canvas, each adding to a dramatic masterpiece of natural engineering. For us today, the channeled scablands serve as a reminder of the power of water and ice. They're proof that the Earth can change in ways that seem impossible, and that even stable-looking landscapes can be transformed overnight. Geologists still study these areas to understand the dynamics of megafloods, ice sheet collapse, and rapid environmental change. And they continue to inspire awe, because no matter how much science we throw at them, it's hard to truly grasp the scale of what happened. The story of the Scablons also connects to other parts of the world. Similar catastrophic floods likely occurred in Europe, Asia, and other regions with unstable ice sheets. Meltwater pulses weren't a local phenomenon, they were part of a global pattern of change that marked the end of the Ice Age. And humans across the world were experiencing the consequences, whether through rising seas, displaced herds, or changing climates. So, when you look at the Scablons today, remember that it wasn't always this strange, rugged landscape. It was once flat plains, fertile valleys, and familiar hunting grounds. But a series of massive floods, unleashed when ice dams failed, transformed the land forever. Humans adapted. Animals moved. Plants colonized new soil. And the planet kept moving, unstoppable as ever. The birth of the Scablons is a story of power, patience, and sudden change. It's a reminder that even frozen, calm-looking worlds can contain forces that can reshape everything in hours. It's the perfect example of how the end of the Ice Age wasn't a gentle warming, but a dramatic, unstoppable transformation. A transformation that humans witnessed, survived, and remembered. And that's why the Scablons exist today, a frozen memory of water unleashed, ice broken, and a planet that refuses to stay still. A place where the end of the Ice Age is written in stone, water, and ripples that last thousands of years. For humans back then, it was survival. For us today, it's awe, curiosity, and a story that's perfect for drifting off to sleep. As the ice sheets continued to melt and massive floods reshaped the land, something even more dramatic was happening globally. Coastlines were disappearing. Slowly at first, then faster and faster, the oceans were rising, swallowing plains, river valleys, and even some early human settlements. What used to be dry land became shallow seas, and humans who had hunted, gathered, or lived near the water suddenly found themselves on the move. The world was literally being rewritten by water. Sea levels during the peak of the Ice Age were about 120 meters lower than today. That meant vast areas of land were exposed. Land bridges, fertile plains, and shallow seas that are now completely underwater. People could walk from what is now the UK to continental Europe, or from Alaska to Siberia, without a boat. These places were hubs of human activity, rich in game and resources. But as the ice melted, the water returned. Slowly at first, it lapped at the edges of these lands. Then, as ice sheets collapsed and meltwater pulses surged into the oceans, coastlines retreated rapidly, sometimes tens of meters in just a few years. Take, for example, the now submerged land of Doggerland in the North Sea. For thousands of years, it was a lush plain inhabited by hunter-gatherers. Rivers meandered through it, forests stretched across the terrain, and animals roamed freely. Humans lived, hunted, and thrived there. But as the waters rose, Doggerland slowly disappeared beneath the waves. What was once home became a sunken memory, leaving only fragments for archaeologists to discover millennia later. Today, it's almost impossible to imagine that people once walked where ships now sail. Other regions experienced similar fates. Sundaland, a vast area in Southeast Asia that connected many of today's islands, was gradually submerged as the seas rose. Beringia, the land bridge connecting Alaska and Russia, started disappearing, affecting human migration and animal populations. Even fertile plains along the Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf vanished under the rising waters. These lost landscapes were not just geographical features. They were hubs of early human life, communities, and ecosystems that vanished, forcing adaptation or relocation. Humans had to respond quickly. Rising seas didn't leave much room for hesitation. Hunter-gatherer groups were forced inland, following high ground or moving along retreating coastlines. Traditional hunting and gathering grounds were submerged, and people had to learn to navigate a changing environment. Some may have observed unusual tides, expanding rivers, or new lakes forming inland, clues that the earth was shifting beneath their feet. Life demanded flexibility, observation, and constant adaptation. The flooding also affected animals. Herds that had relied on coastal plains for grazing had to migrate to higher ground. Predators followed the prey, and ecosystems were reshuffled. Some areas that were previously rich in food suddenly became dangerous or barren. Humans, always tuned into these patterns, had to adjust their strategies as well. Survival depended on noticing subtle changes in water levels, vegetation, and animal behavior. The pace of change was remarkable. Ancient shorelines can now be found 60 miles offshore, submerged beneath the waves. Imagine a river valley that was once full of fish and freshwater sources, now lying under the North Sea. Or a fertile plain that supported herds of animals, now part of an underwater world. For humans at the time, it must have felt as if the earth itself was moving, and in a way it was. The land was disappearing, reshaped by the melting ice and the returning oceans. Evidence of these submerged landscapes comes from a variety of sources. Sediment cores pulled from the ocean floor show ancient river valleys, soils, and even traces of human habitation. Underwater archaeology has revealed tools, animal bones, and remnants of settlements, providing a glimpse into lives long swallowed by the sea. These discoveries hint at the incredible adaptability of humans, who not only survived but thrived in a world constantly transformed by water. The rising seas also had cultural impacts. Oral traditions may have preserved memories of submerged lands and catastrophic floods. Stories of disappearing lands, rivers overtaking fields, and the sudden retreat of water might have been passed down for generations. These tales could have contributed to the flood myths we know today. From the story of Noah to ancient legends in Asia, the memory of lost coastlines, carried in human imagination, persisted long after the waters had claimed the land. But the flooding wasn't always slow and gradual. Meltwater pulses, ice dam failures, and sudden collapses of glaciers caused rapid rises in sea level. Within years or even months, some areas could be transformed from dry plains to shallow seas. Human populations had to be mobile and alert. Groups that failed to adapt could have faced devastating consequences: starvation, loss of territory, or forced migration. The oceans were both a threat and a guide, shaping where people could live and how they survived. As the Ice Age ended, the combination of melting ice sheets, glacial lake floods, and rising seas permanently reshaped the planet. Modern coastlines began to take shape. River deltas, bays, and estuaries formed where ice once blocked the flow of water. The land that remained became the foundation for future civilizations. Humans, having endured the floods, adapted to new environments and eventually settled in fertile areas along the reshaped coasts. For us today, these submerged landscapes are both a challenge and a treasure. They're hidden beneath water, sometimes for good reason. Exploring them is difficult and dangerous. Yet they hold secrets of human migration, prehistoric life, and the dramatic transformations caused by the end of the Ice Age. They remind us that the Earth is dynamic, that coastlines are fragile, and that humans have always been part of a planet in motion. By the time the Ice Age had fully ended, vast areas of land had disappeared beneath the waves. Coastal communities were forced to migrate, ecosystems shifted, and humans learned to navigate a world shaped by rising seas. The memory of these transformations is written in sediments, submerged landscapes, and stories passed down over millennia. The oceans, once trapped in ice, had returned with a quiet but unstoppable force. And so, the world underwater became part of the story of the Great Floods, a global reminder that water, once released, can reshape everything. For humans, it was survival and adaptation. For the planet, it was transformation on an epic scale. And for us today, it's a tale of wonder, mystery, and a perfect reminder of how the Earth can change, sometimes faster than we ever expect. As the Ice Age ended and waters rose, humans experienced something truly extraordinary. They witnessed coastlines disappearing, rivers swelling beyond recognition, and entire landscapes transformed almost overnight. But unlike us, they didn't have written records, cameras, or even permanent settlements to leave evidence behind. Instead, they had stories. Oral traditions, tales told around fires, passed from parent to child, became the first way humans recorded these incredible events. And many of these stories were about water, floods, and the power of the sea. It's easy to see why. Imagine seeing your hunting grounds submerged, forests swept away, and rivers transforming into raging torrents. It would leave a mark on anyone's mind. These weren't small streams rising after a heavy rain. These were floods that could drown plains, reshape valleys, and erase familiar landmarks. Humans had to flee, adapt, and survive. The memories of these terrifying events, preserved in storytelling, became part of the collective human consciousness. What's fascinating is how similar these flood stories are across cultures, separated by thousands of miles and generations. Take, for example, the story of Noah's Ark in the Middle East, the flood of Gilgamesh in Mesopotamia, Manu in India, or Deucalion in Greece. Each tells of a catastrophic flood, often with a few survivors repopulating the land afterward. Some scientists suggest these myths might be echoes of real events from the end of the Ice Age. People remembering, exaggerating, and passing down what they saw when coastlines vanished and ice-dammed lakes burst. Humans are natural storytellers. A dramatic flood is a story you don't forget. Around the fire at night, people likely recounted the terrifying roar of water, the sight of mammoths fleeing, and the sudden changes in their world. Each retelling would add detail, emotion, and exaggeration, turning real events into epic tales. Over generations, the story might shift, but the core memory, that water could rise, destroy, and reshape the land, would remain. It's important to remember that humans weren't just passive witnesses. They interacted with these events, adapting and surviving. They observed patterns, learned which areas were safe, and followed migrating herds. The flood stories may have served as practical advice as much as myth. Never settle too close to the river, or high ground is safer, could have been encoded in these tales, blending survival tips with storytelling. In that sense, myth and memory were survival tools. Interestingly, oral traditions can preserve memories for thousands of years. Studies of Aboriginal Australian stories, for example, suggest that tales of rising seas and land changes describe events that happened over 7,000 years ago. That's mind-blowing. It means a story told by one generation can carry accurate details about the world long after the people who experienced it are gone. Applied to the end of the Ice Age, it's entirely possible that the flood myths around the world are preserving echoes of real events. Coastlines swallowed, lakes bursting, and landscapes transformed by water. Animals, too, were part of these stories, even if indirectly. Humans watched how herds reacted to rising water or shifting rivers. Mammoths, bison, and deer fleeing floods may have inspired some of the legendary creatures or dramatic events in early storytelling. Early humans were keen observers. If they saw the land disappearing, they would have noticed the behavior of animals, the changing currents, and even weather patterns, all woven into their narratives. Flood stories also have a psychological component. Humans remember dramatic events better than ordinary days. The brain is wired to encode survival-relevant experiences. So a catastrophic flood would leave a lasting impression. Around the campfire, people would recount what happened, emphasizing danger, water, and survival. Fear, awe, and respect for nature became central themes. Over time, these tales transformed into legends, eventually forming the backbone of mythology in multiple cultures. Some researchers argue that the universality of flood myths hints at a shared human experience, that end-of-ice age floods were so significant they left marks on populations across continents. While we can't prove that every myth comes from a specific event, the parallels are striking. Submerged coastlines, glacial lake outbursts, and rising seas provide a plausible backdrop for these stories. The water was real, the destruction was real, and humans remembered, and that memory became myth. It's also fascinating how these stories blend reality and imagination. A flood wipes out a community, and over time, it becomes a story of divine wrath, survival, and rebirth. Mammoths, rivers, and mountains may be replaced by gods, heroes, or magical boats. But at the heart, there's always a kernel of truth, humans witnessing a world transformed by water. Oral traditions were, in a way, humanity's first history books. They encoded events, survival lessons, and warnings, all wrapped in narrative, rhythm, and emotion. We also have to consider the scale of what humans were witnessing. Ice dam collapses, meltwater pulses, and rising seas weren't minor floods. These were continental-scale events, reshaping landscapes, drowning valleys, and altering coastlines. Imagine living in a world where familiar rivers no longer flowed as they should, where the land could disappear in a generation. These were events worthy of myth, epic storytelling, and careful memory preservation. By the end of this period, humans had seen firsthand the power of water, ice, and climate. They had survived massive floods, migrated to higher ground, and adapted to a rapidly changing world. And in the stories they told, they ensured that these lessons would survive long after the floodwaters receded. Myths and memories became intertwined, preserving both the awe and the warning for future generations. So, the next time you hear a flood story, Noah's Ark, Gilgamesh, or any other, remember that it may not just be fiction. It could be a whisper from our ancestors, a memory of a world transformed by melting ice, rising seas, and unstoppable water. These stories are ancient echoes, connecting us to humans who lived 15,000 years ago, watching coastlines disappear and surviving the most dramatic environmental changes our planet has ever seen. In the end, myths and memories aren't just entertaining tales. They are windows into human resilience, ingenuity, and the power of storytelling to preserve history. And as we drift off to sleep tonight, imagining the roaring floods and vanishing coastlines, we are, in a way, listening to those first storytellers, the humans who survived the end of the Ice Age and passed down the tale of the Great Flood. Just when humans might have thought the worst of the Ice Age was over, the planet decided to hit the pause button. After thousands of years of slow warming, rising seas, and flooding, something strange happened around 12,900 years ago. The Earth cooled, and not just a little. Temperatures in some regions dropped dramatically, rivers froze again, and glaciers advanced slightly. Scientists call this sudden cold snap the Younger Dryas, and it was like nature pressing the reset button on the warming world. The Younger Dryas was abrupt. One year, humans were noticing milder weather, longer growing seasons, and better hunting conditions. The next, the climate flipped. Some areas experienced decades of sudden cold, storms, and shifting ecosystems. Rivers slowed, lakes refilled, and even some megafauna like mammoths had to adjust their migration patterns. It must have been confusing, scary, and a little frustrating. Imagine packing up camp for spring and then getting hit by a sudden, icy blast. So, what caused this sudden chill? One leading idea involves the massive meltwater pulses we talked about earlier. When enormous amounts of freshwater from glacial lakes suddenly poured into the oceans, it disrupted ocean currents, especially the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, or AMOC for short. This giant conveyor belt of warm and cold ocean currents helps regulate the climate. Dumping so much freshwater into the North Atlantic could slow or even temporarily shut down this system, cooling the northern hemisphere dramatically. Think of it as turning off the Earth's thermostat. Humans living through this period had to respond fast. The animals they hunted were affected. Herds moved differently, rivers froze or became harder to navigate, and food sources shifted. Humans had already been adapting to rising seas and floodplains, and now they faced a return to harsher conditions. Camps had to be relocated, strategies changed, and survival once again depended on observation, flexibility, and a little luck. Life had gone from "things are slowly getting easier" to "okay, now what?" The Younger Dryas also provides insight into how connected Earth systems are. Ice sheets, oceans, and the atmosphere weren't independent. A sudden collapse of ice or a massive pulse of meltwater could ripple across continents, altering weather patterns, precipitation, and temperature. A flood in North America could influence storms in Europe or droughts in Asia. For humans at the time, the world suddenly seemed unpredictable, a reminder that the climate is a delicate, interconnected system, even if you didn't know anything about thermohaline circulation or ocean currents. Interestingly, evidence for the Younger Dryas comes from ice cores, lake sediments, and even tiny pollen grains. Ice cores, drilled deep into Greenland, reveal layers of dust and snow that show how quickly temperatures dropped. Lake sediments record sudden changes in water levels and plant life. Pollen tells the story of shifting vegetation as forests struggled to survive. Together, these clues show that the Younger Dryas wasn't just a minor fluctuation, it was a global-scale event with dramatic consequences for life on Earth. Animals were hit hard. Some species adapted by moving to lower latitudes or taking refuge in ice-free areas called refugia. Others, unable to cope with the rapid change, faced decline or extinction. Megafauna like the woolly mammoth, mastodon, and giant sloths had to adjust their ranges, feeding habits, and migration patterns. Some species survived only because they were already highly mobile or adaptable. Humans, too, had to rethink their hunting strategies and settlement patterns. Flexibility was survival. The suddenness of the Younger Dryas also made it psychologically challenging for humans. Imagine just getting used to warmer weather, planting seeds, or following migrating herds, and then, boom, the world freezes again. Food becomes scarce, rivers slow, and winters become harsher. These conditions would have tested human ingenuity, forcing communities to innovate, cooperate, and survive under extreme stress. It's one of the earliest examples of humans responding to abrupt climate change and succeeding. Some researchers also link the Younger Dryas to mysterious events like megafloods and sudden ecosystem shifts. Ice-dammed lakes that survived the earlier meltwater pulses may have burst again, adding another layer of chaos. Coastal regions, already struggling with rising seas, had to contend with sudden cold snaps. It was a world of extremes, too much water in some places, freezing temperatures in others. Humans were learning, slowly, that the Earth could surprise them in ways no one could predict. The Younger Dryas eventually ended, as all things do. Around 11,700 years ago, temperatures started rising again, glaciers retreated, and the warming trend resumed. But the memory of that cold snap, and the survival strategies it forced on humans, left a lasting mark. Communities had learned resilience, observation, and adaptation. Humans had seen that the world could flip from mild to extreme in a generation, and they survived. For us today, the Younger Dryas is both fascinating and humbling. It shows that Earth's climate can change abruptly, on scales far beyond our daily experience. It highlights the delicate balance of oceans, ice sheets, and atmospheric systems. And it reminds us that humans, even in tiny numbers compared to the global population today, can survive and adapt to extreme environmental change. The Younger Dryas also sets the stage for the final chapters of the Ice Age story. After this period of sudden cold, the Earth would finally enter the relatively stable climate we live in today. But the lessons from the Younger Dryas, rapid change, resilience, and the interconnectedness of Earth systems, remain relevant, especially as we think about modern climate challenges. Humans survived floods, rising seas, and sudden freezes. And yet, they also had to respect the power of the planet, learning that survival meant paying attention, moving wisely, and adapting quickly. So, when we think about the end of the Ice Age, it wasn't a simple, steady warming. It was full of twists, surprises, and even a dramatic cold snap that reminded everyone, humans, animals, and landscapes alike, that Earth could be unpredictable. The Younger Dryas was a final, mysterious curtain call before the world fully warmed. It was dramatic, it was powerful, and it was, in many ways, a test of human endurance and adaptability. And as the planet slowly warmed again, humans continued their journey, shaped by floods, ice, and sudden freezes. They had learned to survive. They had learned to observe. And they had learned the most important lesson of all. The Earth is powerful, unpredictable, and always in motion. And maybe, just maybe, that knowledge was passed down in stories. Stories that eventually became myths, legends, and the tales we still tell today. Around the time of the Younger Dryas, something mysterious happened that still makes scientists scratch their heads. While the Earth was suddenly cooling and ice sheets were unstable, some researchers began to wonder, could a cosmic visitor, an asteroid or comet, have played a role in this sudden climate shift? This idea, called the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, is controversial, but it's fascinating, and it adds a little cosmic spice to the story of Earth's dramatic Ice Age ending. Here's the basic idea. About 12,900 years ago, a large object from space, think asteroid, meteor, or comet fragment, may have struck the Earth, exploded in the atmosphere, or even hit the surface. The explosion could have caused massive wildfires, vaporized large amounts of ice and rock, and thrown dust into the atmosphere. This dust, floating high above the planet, could have blocked sunlight for years, contributing to the sudden cooling of the Younger Dryas. In short, it could have acted like an instant planetary shade, making the Earth colder almost overnight. Evidence for this cosmic impact is intriguing, though far from universally accepted. Scientists point to layers of nanodiamonds, melted glass, and unusual concentrations of charcoal in sediment layers dating to the start of the Younger Dryas. These materials suggest extreme heat, intense fires, or shock events, things that could result from a cosmic collision. Some researchers also note a sudden die-off of megafauna and rapid changes in human settlements around this time, hinting at a sudden environmental catastrophe. But, as with most exciting theories, there's controversy. Not everyone agrees that these markers prove a cosmic impact. Some scientists argue that the nanodiamonds and melt glass could be explained by natural wildfires, volcanic activity, or even human-made fires. Others point out that sediment layers can be tricky to interpret, and that evidence for such an impact is still patchy and localized. In short, it's a maybe rather than a certainty. Perfect for bedtime curiosity, because it's mysterious, dramatic, and slightly thrilling. What's fun about this theory is imagining the moment from a human perspective. Early humans might have seen fiery streaks in the sky, felt tremors, or witnessed forests suddenly igniting. Smoke would have filled the air, blocking sunlight, and temperatures would have dropped. It must have been terrifying, a reminder that the Earth is not just shaped by ice and water, but occasionally by visitors from space. For humans who survived, these events would have been etched into memory, perhaps even inspiring some of the flood myths or fire and flood tales passed down through generations. The cosmic impact idea also highlights how interconnected Earth systems are. Even a relatively small asteroid could trigger massive environmental consequences. Ice sheets destabilized, oceans warmed or cooled, rivers and lakes overflowed, forests burned, and humans, small and adaptable but vulnerable, had to respond. The planet, in essence, was a complex system sensitive to both internal changes, like ice dam failures, and external shocks like a meteor from space. One of the most fascinating aspects of this hypothesis is how it ties together different pieces of evidence from around the world. Ice cores from Greenland show sudden temperature shifts. Lake sediments in North America indicate wildfires and rapid environmental changes. Archaeological sites reveal abrupt shifts in human settlement patterns. When you put it all together, it's almost like a cosmic puzzle. Could a single, dramatic event have influenced all these changes simultaneously? Some scientists say yes, some say no, and some say maybe, which is a perfect bedtime thought. Mystery is always more fun when it's slightly unsolved. Even if the cosmic impact didn't happen, thinking about it is useful. It reminds us that Earth has always faced external threats, from comets, asteroids, and meteorites. These events are rare, yes, but they can have dramatic consequences. Humanity's ability to survive the Younger Dryas, whether caused by an impact, ice melt, or both, shows resilience, adaptability, and the capacity to respond to sudden, unpredictable disasters. Early humans lived through fires, floods, and freezes, and somehow they thrived. That's inspiring. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis also emphasizes patience and perspective. While the idea of a cosmic visitor is exciting, scientists must carefully weigh evidence, consider alternatives, and understand the limits of what the data can tell us. It's a reminder that history, even prehistory, is full of mysteries, and that every rock, sediment layer, and fossil has a story to tell. Some stories are clear, others are speculative, and some might never be fully understood. And that's okay. Mystery is part of the magic. So, whether or not a space rock played a role in the Younger Dryas, the episode remains one of the most dramatic periods in human prehistory. Ice sheets destabilized, coastlines shifted, and floods reshaped continents. If a cosmic impact added fuel to the fire, well, it makes the story even more dramatic. Humans surviving a rapidly cooling world, oceans rising, and firestorms igniting across the landscape. It's a mix of water, ice, and cosmic chaos, like a thriller unfolding in slow motion across millennia. And from a bedtime story perspective, it's perfect. Humans living 12,900 years ago, seeing sudden cold, wildfires and environmental upheaval, adapting to survive, and perhaps passing these events down in stories, some of which eventually became myths. It's a reminder that our ancestors were clever, resilient, and observant, and that they faced challenges that would make modern humans shiver just thinking about them. And maybe, just maybe, some cosmic spark added a little extra drama to their lives. In the end, the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis remains a tantalizing what-if in the story of the Ice Age. It may never be fully proven, and that's okay. The mystery keeps the imagination alive, encourages curiosity, and reminds us how complex Earth's history really is. Whether caused by ice, water, or a visitor from space, the Younger Dryas shaped the world, tested humanity, and left a legacy that we're still piecing together today. So as we drift into sleep, imagine the Earth 12,900 years ago. Freezing temperatures, raging rivers, smoke in the skies, and humans huddled together, watching the world change around them. Maybe a shooting star crossed the sky, or maybe it was something bigger. Either way, the Earth was alive, unpredictable, and full of wonder. And humans, small but clever, survived. And that, in itself, is a story worth telling. After the sudden cold of the Younger Dryas, the Earth finally decided it was done playing tricks. Temperatures started to rise again, glaciers retreated, and the planet moved into a relatively stable climate, the one we live in today. This final meltdown of the Ice Age was dramatic, long-lasting, and absolutely transformative. The frozen world that had dominated for tens of thousands of years slowly gave way to rivers, lakes, fertile valleys, and coastlines resembling what we recognize now. It wasn't a quiet process. The last of the giant ice sheets, massive slabs of ice covering North America, Europe, and parts of Asia, began to collapse. Imagine glaciers taller than skyscrapers slowly melting, rivers of ice flowing into valleys, and massive chunks of ice breaking off into lakes and oceans. These meltwaters contributed to rising seas worldwide, flooding lowlands, and forcing humans and animals alike to adjust quickly. The world was changing, and it was unstoppable. One of the most dramatic consequences of this final meltdown was the reshaping of coastlines. Areas that had been exposed during the Ice Age were gradually submerged as the oceans rose. Doggerland in the North Sea disappeared beneath the waves, Sundaland in Southeast Asia was partly submerged, and the Beringia land bridge slowly vanished. For humans, this meant migrating inland, adjusting hunting grounds, and rethinking where they could settle. The planet's natural map was being redrawn, and humans had to read it fast. Megafauna, too, felt the impact. Animals like mammoths, mastodons, giant sloths, and saber-toothed cats were already under stress from climate shifts, human hunting, and habitat loss. As ice melted, forests expanded, grasslands changed, and new ecosystems emerged. Some species adapted, moving to new regions. Others couldn't keep up and faced extinction. The final meltdown played a huge role in shaping the animal world we know today. It was survival of the most flexible, literally. Rivers and lakes also found their modern paths during this period. Glacial meltwater carved new channels, filled valleys, and formed deltas. Ancient waterways that had been blocked or rerouted by ice finally settled into stable courses. The Mississippi, the Rhine, the Thames, all these rivers were shaped or stabilized during the final stages of the Ice Age. Humans living near these waterways gained access to fresh water, fish, and fertile floodplains, setting the stage for the rise of civilizations much later. The landscape changes weren't just practical, they were dramatic and awe-inspiring. Entire valleys carved by megafloods were left with enormous ripple marks, cliffs, and coulees. Mountains and hills, once pressed down by the weight of ice, slowly rebounded in a process called isostatic rebound. Forests sprouted where tundra once dominated, and grasslands expanded into newly ice-free areas. Earth itself seemed to be breathing again, recovering from the heavy, frozen grip of the Ice Age. Humans, small and clever, were key players in this story. They migrated along newly exposed valleys, adapted to shifting coastlines, and learned to live with the rapidly changing environment. Hunting strategies evolved as herds moved into new areas. Fishing became more important as rivers and lakes stabilized. Some groups experimented with early agriculture, planting seeds in fertile post-glacial soils. Humans were no longer just surviving, they were beginning to shape the world themselves. The final meltdown also left a geological legacy we can still see today. Glacial moraines, erratic boulders, fjords, and newly formed river valleys are all reminders of this period. Even features like the Great Lakes in North America were carved and filled by melting ice. Every lake, river, and valley tells a story of a world reshaped by water and ice, a landscape molded in a relatively short time compared to geological scales. Another interesting effect was on global climate patterns. As ice sheets disappeared, ocean currents stabilized. Monsoons, rainfall patterns, and winds began to resemble modern systems. This created a more predictable climate for humans and animals alike, allowing agriculture to eventually flourish and civilizations to develop. The final meltdown didn't just change the land, it changed the conditions for life itself. For early humans, the end of the Ice Age must have felt like the world finally catching its breath. Seasons became more predictable, rivers flowed consistently, and animals returned to stable habitats. Coastal plains emerged, valleys became fertile, and resources became more reliable. Humans had endured floods, freezes, and extreme changes. Now, they could start to settle, experiment with farming, and build communities. It was a turning point, from nomadic survival to the first steps toward organized society. Yet the lessons of the final meltdown were clear. The Earth can change rapidly, sometimes in ways humans can't control. Ice sheets collapse, seas rise, rivers flood, and climates shift. Humans survived because they adapted, observed, and moved with the world. They learned resilience, patience, and the importance of paying attention to environmental cues. Lessons still relevant today as we face our own changes to climate and coastlines. And so, the final meltdown of the Ice Age marks a profound transformation of the planet. Land, water, and life were all reshaped. Humans learned to survive in a world that could change drastically, and many species adapted, while others disappeared. The stage was set for the modern world, with coastlines, rivers, and ecosystems taking the forms we now recognize. The Earth, once frozen and rigid, had finally warmed, and life moved forward. Looking back, it's incredible to imagine this transformation. Entire continents redefined, oceans rising, ice disappearing, and humans finding ways to survive. The final meltdown wasn't just about melting ice, it was about a world learning to breathe again, a planet reshaped by the unstoppable forces of water and ice. And humans, clever, adaptable, and resilient, were there, witnessing it, learning from it, and preparing for the next chapter of life on Earth. The final meltdown reminds us that Earth is alive, powerful, and always changing. And as we imagine these massive ice sheets retreating, rivers carving new paths, and landscapes transforming, it's impossible not to feel awe. Humans survived, animals adapted, and the planet moved forward, forever transformed, and forever teaching lessons about resilience, change, and the unstoppable flow of time. As the Ice Age finally drew to a close and the final meltdown reshaped the planet, humans found themselves in a world full of opportunity and new challenges. The relentless floods, melting glaciers, and rising seas had forced them to move, adapt, and innovate for thousands of years. Now, the land was stabilizing, rivers were flowing steadily, and fertile soils were emerging from the ice's retreat. It was the perfect stage for humans to start experimenting with a new way of life. Settlement. For tens of thousands of years, humans had been nomads, following herds of animals, moving with the seasons, and camping wherever resources allowed. Life was simple in some ways. No taxes, no commuting, no bills, but survival was constant work. You had to track game, gather edible plants, and avoid predators or harsh weather. Every day was a negotiation with nature. But as the Ice Age ended, the post-glacial landscapes offered a different kind of challenge: abundance and stability. Humans were about to realize they could settle down, at least in some areas, without constantly moving. Fertile river valleys became magnets for early humans. The Levant, parts of the Fertile Crescent, and river plains in Asia provided rich soils, reliable water sources, and abundant plants and animals. Humans began experimenting with planting seeds, tending small plots, and managing resources in ways that went beyond simple foraging. They were slowly learning that they could influence their environment, rather than just reacting to it. Agriculture was on the horizon, and with it, the first steps toward permanent settlements. But settlement wasn't just about convenience. It was about survival. The changing climate, rising seas, and disappearing coastlines meant that humans couldn't rely on the same strategies that had worked for millennia. Hunting and gathering remained important, but they needed a backup plan. By cultivating plants, they could stabilize their food supply. By domesticating animals, they could ensure protein even when wild herds moved on. It was an early form of human ingenuity, learning to work with the earth, rather than constantly chasing it. Migration patterns also shifted as the land stabilized. Humans who had been forced inland during floods began exploring newly exposed areas. Some groups moved into fertile lowlands near rivers, while others settled along emerging coastlines rich in fish and shellfish. This flexibility allowed humans to spread into regions that had previously been inaccessible. Rising seas had taken some territories, but they also revealed new opportunities for survival, trade, and innovation. Humans were learning to read a world constantly in motion. Social structures began to change as well. Settling in one place required cooperation, planning, and organization. People had to share water, manage crops, and defend their communities. Tasks became specialized. Some hunted, others farmed, and others focused on toolmaking. This division of labor laid the foundation for more complex societies. Humans were no longer just isolated bands of hunters. They were small communities learning to thrive together. And with these early settlements came the first hints of long-term culture, traditions, stories, and knowledge that could be passed down more consistently than ever before. Technology evolved alongside settlement. Early humans developed better tools for farming, fishing, and building shelters. They learned to store food for the winter, construct durable homes, and make use of natural resources in smarter ways. This period also saw advances in pottery, weaving, and even early forms of trade. Humans were not only adapting to the environment, they were shaping it to meet their needs, slowly turning the Earth into a partner rather than an adversary. The end of the Ice Age also changed human diets. With glaciers retreating and ecosystems stabilizing, humans had access to a wider variety of plants and animals. Seeds could be collected and sown, fish could be trapped in rivers, and game could be hunted with more predictable results. This dietary expansion supported population growth, allowing humans to build larger settlements and form the social networks that would later give rise to cities and civilizations. Even the psychology of humans adapted. After millennia of survival under extreme conditions, floods, cold snaps, rising seas, and sudden climate shifts, humans had learned patience, observation, and innovation. They knew that the world could change quickly, but they also discovered that with careful planning, cooperation, and ingenuity, they could thrive. These lessons became embedded in culture, stories, and daily life, shaping the trajectory of humanity for thousands of years to come. The rise of settlements didn't mean the end of movement. Humans still migrated when conditions demanded it, but settlement provided stability, allowing them to plan for the long term. Seasonal hunting trips, trade expeditions, and resource gatherings still occurred, but now there was a home base, a place to return to, store food, and raise children. This balance between mobility and permanence was a key adaptation that allowed humans to thrive in a post-Ice Age world. One of the most remarkable things about this period is how quickly humans learned to take advantage of the new environment. Within a few centuries, humans went from nomadic bands to small villages, experimenting with crops, domesticating animals, and managing resources. They were building the foundation for the first civilizations, all because they had survived floods, ice, and rapid climate change, and adapted to the new world it left behind. By the end of this period, humans were no longer just survivors. They were innovators, planners, and early engineers of their environment. Settlements became hubs of culture, learning, and cooperation. Humans had endured some of the most dramatic environmental changes in history and had emerged stronger, wiser, and ready to shape the future. The end of the Ice Age was not just about melting ice and rising seas. It was about humanity learning to thrive in a world forever changed. And as humans settled, planted, and built communities, the lessons of survival passed down from generation to generation. Stories of floods, melting ice, and freezing winters became part of culture, reminding future humans of what it meant to adapt, innovate, and endure. It was a quiet but profound transformation. From nomads following herds to settlers shaping the land, humans had finally learned how to live with, and sometimes even tame, a world of extreme change. The post-Ice Age era was, in many ways, the dawn of human civilization. And it all began with resilience, observation, and the courage to settle in a world that had already tested them in ways unimaginable. The great floods, icy cold snaps, and rising seas weren't just challenges. They were the teachers that shaped humanity's future. Even after humans began settling in post-Ice Age landscapes, there were still mysteries lurking beneath the waves. Entire worlds that had been home to humans, animals, and thriving ecosystems were now completely submerged. These are the lost lands, places like Doggerland in the North Sea, Sundaland in Southeast Asia, and Beringia, the land bridge connecting Alaska and Siberia. They were once bustling hubs of life, now hidden underwater, waiting for us to rediscover them. Take Doggerland, for example. Thousands of years ago, it was a lush plain filled with rivers, forests, and animals roaming freely. Humans hunted here, fished in rivers, and lived off the fertile land. But as the Ice Age ended and the oceans rose, Doggerland slowly disappeared. By around 6,000 years ago, most of it was underwater, leaving only a few islands before it vanished completely. Today, the area is beneath the North Sea, mostly known only to fishermen and archaeologists who occasionally pull up ancient bones or tools from the seabed. Sundaland tells a similar story, but on a massive scale. What is now Indonesia was once a continuous landmass, connecting thousands of islands into one vast territory. Humans and animals roamed freely, exploiting fertile soils, abundant rivers, and coastal resources. As the sea levels rose, this land was gradually submerged, reshaping Southeast Asia's geography and forcing human populations to relocate. Islands that were once connected became isolated, changing migration patterns and cutting off human communities from one another. Then there's Beringia, the famous land bridge between Alaska and Siberia. During the Ice Age, this was a dry corridor connecting Asia and North America, allowing humans, animals, and plants to migrate across continents. Mammoths, bison, and humans all used this bridge to move back and forth. But as ice sheets melted and sea levels rose, the bridge was swallowed by water, isolating populations on either side. It's hard to overstate how important Beringia was. Without it, human migration into the Americas might have looked very different. These lost lands weren't just empty spaces. They were ecosystems, hunting grounds, and homes. Rivers flowed through valleys, animals grazed in plains, and humans made tools, settled, and survived. In many ways, these submerged worlds were just as real as the lands we inhabit today. And yet, because they are underwater, much of their history is hidden. It's only through underwater archaeology, sediment cores, and occasional accidental discoveries that we get glimpses of what life was like. Archaeologists have pulled up fascinating evidence: stone tools, remnants of dwellings, animal bones, and even early human footprints preserved in mud. These fragments tell stories of human ingenuity, migration, and survival. They remind us that humans were thriving, exploring, and adapting long before modern civilizations existed, and that some of their worlds were lost to rising seas. Imagine discovering a spear point on the seabed and realizing it belonged to someone who lived thousands of years ago on land that no longer exists. It's like touching history that vanished beneath the waves. The Gulf Oasis in the Persian Gulf is another example. During the Ice Age, it was a fertile area with rivers, lakes, and wildlife. Humans and animals lived there for thousands of years. But as sea levels rose, it slowly disappeared, forcing populations to move inland. Entire communities, familiar landscapes, and resources were lost, leaving only traces for us to study today. These submerged landscapes were part of a network of human migration, connecting early communities across continents. One reason these lost worlds remain mysterious is accessibility. Exploring underwater sites is difficult, expensive, and sometimes dangerous. Oceans and seas hide layers of sediment, erosion, and shifting sand, making it tricky to find archaeological evidence. Unlike terrestrial digs, underwater archaeology requires specialized technology, diving expertise, and patience. That's why so many of these submerged worlds are still largely unexplored, waiting silently for us to uncover their secrets. But even if we can't study all of them yet, these lost lands remind us of the dramatic changes Earth has undergone. Sea levels didn't rise gradually and quietly. They reshaped continents, cut off migrations, and forced humans to adapt. Today, cities, farms, and coastlines sit atop land that was once dry during the Ice Age. Every river delta, bay, or shallow sea tells a story of a vanished world beneath the waves. And it's not just about lost humans. Flora and fauna were affected too. Plants that thrived on exposed plains were drowned. Animals that grazed in fertile valleys had to migrate or perish. Ecosystems were reconfigured, creating the patterns of life we see today. In a way, these lost worlds beneath the waves were nature's own experiment, showing how species, including humans, respond to rapid environmental change. The human imagination has always been fascinated by submerged lands. Myths of sunken cities, lost continents, and watery realms may have roots in memories of these vanished landscapes. Stories of Atlantis, sunken kingdoms, or mysterious oceans may be cultural echoes of humans remembering, even unconsciously, places they or their ancestors once inhabited. These tales blend history, memory, and imagination, creating a bridge between real events and storytelling, the same way flood myths preserved memories of Ice Age megafloods. For modern humans, lost worlds beneath the waves are both a challenge and a treasure. They remind us of how fragile coastlines are, how adaptable humans must be, and how dramatically the Earth can change. They hold secrets about migration, survival, and prehistoric life. Secrets that are slowly being uncovered with every dive, sediment core, and archaeological discovery. And they spark wonder, curiosity, and a sense of connection to humans who lived long before us in lands we can only imagine. In the end, these lost worlds are reminders that the Earth is always in motion. Ice melts, seas rise, and continents transform. Humans adapt, migrate, and thrive. And beneath the waves, the stories of those who lived, hunted, and survived are waiting, preserved in silence, to remind us of the resilience of life and the fleeting nature of landscapes. So as we drift to sleep tonight, we can imagine ancient plains beneath the ocean, rivers that no longer exist, and humans walking where waves now wash over the seabed. These lost worlds beneath the waves are part of the grand story of our planet, a story of survival, change, and wonder that stretches back tens of thousands of years. And just like the humans of the Ice Age, we are part of a world that is always transforming, always surprising, and always full of stories waiting to be told. By the time the Ice Age had fully retreated, rivers carved new paths, coastlines shifted, and humans had begun settling in the fertile lands left behind. But the story of the Great Floods wasn't just about ice melting or land disappearing. Its effects echoed through generations, shaping humanity, wildlife, geography, and even the stories we tell. The Great Flood at the end of the Ice Age left a legacy that we can still see, if we know where to look. Let's start with humans. The floods forced migrations, and migrations forced adaptation. Communities had to move inland, find new hunting grounds, and adjust to unfamiliar landscapes. Some groups merged, sharing knowledge and tools. Others split into smaller bands, exploring unknown territories. This movement not only spread human populations across continents, but also accelerated innovation. Tools became sharper, hunting strategies smarter, and survival instincts finely tuned. The Great Flood, terrifying as it was, became a driver of human ingenuity. Beyond immediate survival, the post-flood world set the stage for early agriculture. Rivers and lakes left behind fertile plains, rich in nutrients from glacial sediments. Humans discovered that they could cultivate seeds, plant crops, and eventually store food. This wasn't just convenience, it was a revolution. The Great Flood indirectly encouraged humans to experiment with farming, which would later give rise to permanent settlements and civilizations. Without the dramatic reshaping of the land, these fertile areas might never have existed in the form we recognize today. The floods also influenced the spread of humans across the planet. Rising seas submerged coastal areas, forcing early humans to explore new regions and establish trade or communication networks. Entire cultures adapted to inland life, while others became skilled at fishing and navigating coastal waters. Migration patterns, settlement locations, and population distribution all carry traces of the Ice Age floods. In a way, the floods were like invisible hands, guiding the path of humanity across continents. Animals, too, were deeply affected. Some megafauna were already declining due to climate change, hunting, and habitat loss, but the floods accelerated the pressure on species. Mammoths, giant sloths, and saber-toothed cats had to adapt, migrate, or die. As habitats shifted, ecosystems changed. New predator-prey relationships emerged, vegetation patterns were altered, and the foundations of modern biodiversity began to take shape. In short, the floods weren't just a human story. They reshaped life on Earth in profound ways. Geography itself bears the marks of these ancient waters. The scablands of North America, dry falls carved by megafloods, and giant ripple marks in riverbeds all testify to the sheer force of water during this period. Coastlines now hundreds of miles from their Ice Age positions, sunken river valleys, and reshaped deltas are living records of the floods. Even today, when we study maps, rivers, or landscapes, we're reading the Earth's memory of that dramatic period. The floods left a fingerprint that's impossible to erase. And then there are the myths. Humans are natural storytellers, and cataclysmic floods made powerful stories. Tales like Noah's Ark, Gilgamesh's flood, Manu in India, and Deucalion in Greece may all echo real events from the end of the Ice Age. Oral traditions preserved the memory of sudden waters, displaced humans, and transformed landscapes. These myths weren't just entertainment. They were memory aids, survival guides, and cautionary tales encoded in story form. The floods became legend, ensuring that humans remembered the power of water long after the event itself had passed. The legacy of the floods also teaches us about resilience. Humans survived, adapted, and thrived. Communities learned to read environmental cues, follow migrating herds, cultivate new lands, and settle in ways that balanced mobility with permanence. They faced rising seas, melting ice, and sudden climate shifts, yet found ways to endure. Their survival strategies laid the groundwork for later societies, cities, and civilizations. The floods were devastating, yes, but they also created opportunity for growth, innovation, and adaptation. We can also see lessons for today. The Earth's climate can shift rapidly, oceans can rise, and extreme events can reshape landscapes. While the scale was larger and slower than what humans face today, the story of the Great Flood reminds us of nature's power, unpredictability, and interconnectedness. Ice sheets, rivers, coastlines, and humans all influence one another. Understanding how ancient floods affected life, settlement, and migration can help us appreciate the delicate balance of our modern world. Even submerged lands, like Doggerland, Sundaland, and Beringia, remind us that what seems permanent can vanish in a blink of geological time. Entire ecosystems, human settlements, and landscapes disappeared beneath the waves. Today, these lost worlds inspire curiosity, exploration, and imagination. They are a testament to the planet's ability to change and a reminder that humans must always adapt, learn, and respect the forces of nature. The Great Flood's legacy also lives in culture, memory, and myth. Stories passed from generation to generation kept humans connected to the past, informed survival strategies, and even influenced spiritual beliefs. Humans learned to respect water, predict floods, and live in harmony with natural rhythms. These lessons, embedded in mythology, folklore, and culture, show that even catastrophe can teach, guide, and shape the future. In essence, the Great Flood was more than a historical event. It was a turning point. It shaped humans, animals, geography, climate understanding, and even storytelling. Its impact was both immediate and long-lasting. From reshaped coastlines to migration patterns, from lost worlds beneath the waves to myths that endure today, the floods left a mark that persists tens of thousands of years later. Humans who survived this period learned resilience, adaptability, and ingenuity, lessons that continue to inspire us today. So, when we imagine the end of the Ice Age, it's not just ice melting or seas rising. It's humans moving, adapting, learning, and surviving. It's rivers carving landscapes, animals migrating, and coastlines being redrawn. It's myths being born, stories being told, and memories preserved. The Great Flood may have ended the Ice Age, but it also shaped the very foundation of the human story, leaving a lasting legacy that still resonates in the world around us. And as we close our eyes tonight, we can picture those rising waters, disappearing coastlines, and the first humans learning to adapt. Their courage, ingenuity, and resilience echo across time, reminding us that even in the face of immense change, life finds a way. The Great Flood was terrifying, transformative, and unforgettable, and its legacy continues to shape the world, just as it shaped the people who lived through it. As we reach the final chapter of our story, it's time to step back and reflect. The Ice Age ended in dramatic fashion, with towering glaciers melting, rivers carving new paths, seas rising, and humans adapting to a world in constant motion. But these events weren't just ancient history. They carry lessons, warnings, and inspiration for the world we live in today. The echoes of the Ice Age remind us that the Earth is alive, powerful, and sometimes unpredictable. Think about it. Humans survived massive floods, sudden freezes, melting ice sheets, and the disappearance of entire lands beneath rising seas. Megafauna disappeared, coastlines shifted, and ecosystems were upended. Yet humans adapted, innovated, and thrived. We learned to read the land, follow the herds, settle near rivers, cultivate crops, and build communities. Our ancestors' resilience in the face of extreme change is a story of survival, creativity, and ingenuity, a story that still resonates. Today, we live in a world shaped by the Ice Age's end. Rivers flow where glaciers carved valleys. Coastlines have risen, swallowing ancient plains. Fertile soils left behind by retreating ice support millions of people and countless ecosystems. Even the myths and stories from that era, from global floods to sunken lands, remind us that humans have always tried to understand and navigate a changing world. These echoes are everywhere, in the landscapes, in the stories, and in the lessons about adaptation and resilience. One of the clearest messages of the Ice Age story is the power of rapid change. Climate can shift abruptly. Seas can rise faster than expected. Ecosystems can transform. The Younger Dryas showed us that cooling can happen suddenly, just as the final meltdown showed us that warming can reshape the planet in a matter of centuries. Today, as we face climate change, melting ice sheets, and rising oceans, these ancient lessons are striking. They remind us that even small shifts in the environment can have cascading effects on humans, animals, and the land. Humans today are not so different from our Ice Age ancestors. We face challenges that require observation, adaptation, and ingenuity. While we may have advanced technology, we are still vulnerable to the forces of nature. Just as early humans learned to relocate, innovate, and thrive in a post-glacial world, we too must respond to environmental change thoughtfully and proactively. Resilience isn't new. It's embedded in our DNA, honed over thousands of years of surviving floods, freezes, and disappearing lands. The echoes of the Ice Age also teach us about the importance of balance. The Earth's climate, oceans, and ice sheets are all interconnected. Meltwater pulses could disrupt ocean currents. Sudden cooling could change ecosystems. Floods reshaped continents. every part of the system affects the other. Our ancestors survived because they respected these patterns and adapted accordingly. Today, understanding the delicate balance of our planet is more important than ever. Whether it's predicting sea level rise, managing water resources, or protecting biodiversity. We can also learn from the lost worlds beneath the waves. Places like Doggerland, Sunderland, and Beringia remind us that even seemingly permanent landscapes can vanish. Entire ecosystems, human settlements, and cultures disappeared under rising seas. In the modern era, coastal populations face similar challenges. Learning from the past, we see that adaptation, planning, and foresight are key to survival. Protecting communities, managing resources, and respecting nature's power isn't just smart, it's essential. The story of myths and memory also has lessons. Oral traditions preserved experiences of floods, freezes, and environmental upheaval for thousands of years. Stories of catastrophe, survival, and adaptation were passed down to help future generations navigate challenges. In a way, humans have always used storytelling as a tool for survival, for teaching, and for understanding the world. Today, science and data play a similar role, helping us interpret Earth signals and plan for the future. The difference is that we now have the tools to act before disaster strikes, rather than simply reacting. Finally, the Ice Age story reminds us of our potential. Humans not only survived dramatic environmental shifts, but they also thrived afterward. They innovated, settled, cultivated crops, domesticated animals, and eventually built the foundations of civilization. Even in the face of massive floods, cold snaps, and disappearing lands, humans found ways to turn challenges into opportunities. That potential is still within us. By observing, adapting, and cooperating, we can face modern environmental changes with the same resilience and ingenuity. So, as we drift towards sleep tonight, let's imagine the world 15,000 years ago. Towering ice sheets slowly melting, rivers carving new valleys, coastlines shifting, and humans huddled by fires, watching the water rise, the ice fall, and the land change. They survived because they paid attention, adapted quickly, and supported each other. They learned from their environment and passed those lessons down through stories, tools, and culture. And through all this, they left a legacy that still echoes today. The Ice Age, with its floods, freezes, and final meltdown, is more than a story of the past. It's a story of resilience, adaptation, and the remarkable ability of humans to thrive in a changing world. Its echoes remind us that the Earth is powerful, that climate can shift rapidly, and that life, both human and animal, is incredibly resilient. It's a story of survival, ingenuity, and the quiet, persistent rhythm of the planet itself. And as we close our eyes tonight, we can carry that story with us, imagining the icy rivers, the flooded plains, the lost worlds beneath the waves, and the humans who lived, adapted, and thrived. We are part of that ongoing story, inheriting lessons of resilience, foresight, and respect for the Earth. The echoes of the Ice Age remind us that no matter how much the world changes, life finds a way. And sometimes, the best stories are the ones that teach us how to navigate change, gently, patiently, and with a little bit of wonder. And that's our journey through the great floods that ended the Ice Age. Pretty wild, right? From frozen worlds to submerged lands, humans survived, adapted, and thrived. If you loved traveling back in time with me tonight, make sure to hit that subscribe button. It helps me bring you even more stories from history that are just as mind-blowing. And hey, don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed it, and share your thoughts in the comments. Which part of the Ice Age story blew your mind the most? If you want to keep exploring history from the comfort of your bed, check out the video on the screen right now. It's another journey through time that I promise will keep your curiosity awake without keeping you up all night. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story. Sweet dreams, and remember, history is full of surprises.